Supports the piece of legislation but doesn't wish to speak. MelissaMaddenTestimony from the America Votes opposes this piece of legislation and she wishes to speak. Melissa, would you please come forward and address the committee?
Good morning, Senator Barnes, members of the committee. My name is Melissa Bernardin and I'm here representing America Votes. For those of you who are not familiar with us, America Votes is a nonprofit organization that, among other things, works to expand access to the ballot, coordinate issue advocacy and election campaigns, and protect every American's right to vote. I will not read my testimony in its entirety, but there are a few important points I would like to make. We are here today in opposition to Senate Bill 289, a bill under which voters would be required to present photo identification in order to obtain a ballot to cast their vote. While we respect the work that Senator Prescott and others put into this bill and appreciate the opportunity to comment, we continue to be concerned that implementation of ID requirements are costly and unnecessary. While this bill works to ensure that every qualified voter is able to cast their ballot on Election Day, it falls short of that principle and creates burdens that will fall most heavily on traditionally disenfranchised populations. We believe two important components missing from this legislation are, number one, a robust plan to educate the public regarding such a major change to New Hampshire voting laws, and number two, a training program for election officials. Without these components, such legislation is likely to create lines, confusion, and chaos at the New Hampshire polls. We consider this change to be a significant change in our election procedures, and it needs to be clearly communicated to the public, and our largely volunteer force of election administrators need to be properly trained before even a so-called soft implementation of this bill should be considered. Some of you may remember just the rumor that New Hampshire had passed voter ID led to problems in a very low turnout special election last year. The rollout, training, and implementation should be standardized across the state, and this legislation does not provide the needed clear guidelines for local officials. The last point I'd like to make is regarding cost. This legislation is likely to cost millions of dollars, and it is unclear how the sponsors plan to pay for this significant change in the conduct of elections in New Hampshire. I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Melissa. Questions from the committee? Senator Booth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Melissa, for your testimony today. I'm reading your testimony here, and I'm trying to understand, maybe you can explain this for me further. You're right, when you look at the practical effect it would have, and I'm assuming you mean photo identification requirement, on the overall voting population, you will discover unintended effects. And that is the central reason that as an organization that works to protect voter access to the ballot, every America Vote is opposed to this bill. Now, can you explain what you mean by unintended effects, particularly in light of the fact that the bill has been stated by the City and Town Clerks Association, it's been stated by the Secretary of State office, it's been stated by Senator Prescott, that no one will be disenfranchised, no one will go to the ballot and be turned away. So I'm trying to understand, and in particular, what are those unintended effects that you see will be present if this bill is passed?
Thank you, Senator, for your question. I appreciate the opportunity to illustrate what I mean by that. In looking at this type of legislation, and we've carefully looked at proposals in New Hampshire and also photo identification requirements around the country, there's a term called voter suppression, and that is voters who may not have the full picture, may not understand the ins and outs of the legislation. They may hear that there's a photo identification requirement, and they may think, oh, I don't have photo ID. You know, maybe I'm 85 years old, and so I'm not going to bother asking my daughter to drive me to the polls because now I need a picture ID and I don't have one. So that ties into our suggestion that should the legislature move forward with this bill, that a robust public education component does need to be incorporated so that the electorate is clearly informed of the election procedures in the state.
Well, Mr. Chairman. Go right ahead. Thank you. Well, that's a good point, and I would just refer you back to the bill where there is the voter advisory committee, and there's very specific language for Secretary of State's office and city and town clerks to robustly notify the public about the new law. And in fact, if you go on websites in other states, Secretary of State website, you will see some, and I assume we will have this on our website similarly, very clear discussion and explanation of the photo ID and what's required and what the voters can do to make sure that they have the ability to vote without being disenfranchised. The other point, and follow up, Mr. Chairman, again, the other point is, it seems to me, and maybe you can explain where you get your figures, because Secretary of State did not suggest that this was going to cost millions of dollars as you have. Can you give us some reason where are you getting your numbers from? Where do you get this millions of dollars?
It is our hope that if the legislature pursues this legislation, it will look at some of the suggestions that were made here today, one of which is that the public education component does need to be expanded. In looking at legislation that has been considered in other states, there's at least one state that in order for the legislation to stand court scrutiny, the state needed to institute mass media communication. They were required to run primetime TV ads to let the electorate know about the change in voting procedures. With those increased costs, I do believe that the state would be looking at incurring millions of dollars to implement this bill.
Melissa, thank you very much for your testimony. Yes, now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Witness brought up so-called the truth incident, and I wonder if you might comment on your interpretation of what that demonstrates or doesn't, and also perhaps make sure that we all understand where the investigation associated with that stands at this point. And I apologize if this was already discussed in detail. I was over at my prime sponsor bill.
Thank you for the question, Senator. As you can tell, I think that there's a significant amount of attention being paid to this issue, and certainly the incident with Mr. O'Keefe and his videotaping effort during the New Hampshire primary has caused a lot of people to turn their attention to this bill. I believe the question for policymakers is not, the question for policymakers isn't, can voter fraud happen? The question is, does it? And O'Keefe decided, and his folks who participated in that effort, they decided to commit voter fraud in New Hampshire. It's my understanding that they were given a financial contribution to do that videotaping during the New Hampshire primary. We do not believe that that proved anything with that video. Even with photo identification, the possibility of voter fraud will be present. The question is not can it happen, but does it happen? I think I heard someone give the example, O'Keefe could have robbed a bank to show that it's possible. And I was thinking about that this morning. So it's possible to rob a bank, but are we going to put up a security line so that anytime you want to go in and cash a check, you have to go through a metal detector or show your driver license? I think we're at the point where we need to put our trust in the voters of New Hampshire rather than make it much more difficult, if not impossible, to exercise the right to vote.
Thank you, and thank you for your testimony this morning. Would you agree that it adds a level of integrity to the process, since no one is going to be disenfranchised?
Our position remains, Senator, thank you for the question. Our position remains that New Hampshire has some of the strictest voter registration procedures in the country. Voter registration must be done in person with an election official, and our system works. By and large, people have trust in the process.
Thank you, Melissa.
No more questions.
Senator Booth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Melissa, I just want to ask you, are you aware that this legislature, and there's been different players over the years, but this legislature has been working on voter photo identification since 1998. So I just want that clearly understood so that the media doesn't walk away today with the belief that this is a knee-jerk reaction to what Veritas did. But in reality, this is something that this legislature has been working on for years, and Senator Prescott has found a way to bring it all together and to bring the parties together to a bill that's reasonable and will work for the state of New Hampshire. Would you agree?
I am aware that the legislature has been working on this issue for a number of years. Senator.
Okay.
I think we all understand where American Votes stands on this issue. Thank you very much for coming in. You haven't been here since 1998, but you've been here for a good number of years.
Croc TV.